Hello and welcome to The World on Fire. I am your host, Dr. Remy Cross, and what this is let's call it an occasional video series talking about what is happening in the US and globally around protest, activism, and social change. As I mentioned, I am your host, Dr. Remy Cross. You can call me Brian or Remy or Jerkface, but I only really answer to the first two. And my hope in doing this is to share some of the knowledge and insight I've gained in over a quarter century of participating in and studying social protest movements. Um, and the reason, really, I can do this and I want to do this is that oftentimes coverage of protests, protesters, and social change movements by journalists, even investigative journalists, often lacks a deeper understanding of the dynamics that drive these behaviors. And this is fair. Journalists are trained to be journalists. It's unfair to expect them to be experts on activism and activists and protests. But still, there is a need and I hope a desire on the part of many people to gain a better understanding of the whys and hows behind activism and protest. And that's why I'm here. My training is precisely in the hows, whys, and whats of protest and activism. I am a former professor of sociology and criminology, and my scholarly work has focused on radical extremism and grassroots movements, with a particular focus on right wing movements, as well as those that are primarily online. So, about this episode, uh, my intention is that each episode I'll spend a little bit of time breaking down major protest activity in the news cycle before taking a deeper dive into one or more concept that I think are important to understanding some of the major things that are currently occurring, and that can give you a more complete understanding of what's going on. So let's just jump right into the rundown here. Um, Number of things. Obviously, this is not meant to be comprehensive. If I wanted to provide coverage on every protest movement out there, I have no doubt that it would be more than a full-time job. So these are just the highlights. And so when we look at these things, I want to talk about first labor organizing that's been ongoing in the United States here in the American Southeast. And this is notable because we're seeing a resurgence of labor movement, not just in blue collar, but across several different sectors. But in this instance, the Southern organizing is focusing on auto workers. Uh, Full disclosure, I am a member of the UAW. They are the union that represented graduate students and academic workers at two of the universities that I have worked at. So, just as an aside, but here we have auto workers, UAW organizing actual auto workers. And this is notable because traditionally the U.S. southern states have been highly resistant to labor organizing, if not outright hostile. And you've seen quite a bit of union busting coming out of those states historically. And it's been a pretty nasty situation where throughout much of the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, the way that this union busting really occurred was to pit workers against one another on the basis of race. That basically tell white workers that unionization would drag them down because it would mean empowering black workers and vice versa, so that you often had strong resistance to unionization based on race. And this is appearing to change, where we've seen plants in the Carolinas, in Alabama, and in Tennessee vote to unionize, although there was a bit of a setback last week when a Mercedes-Benz plant voted not to unionize. But it's worth keeping an eye on as we sort of see working class and middle class Americans dealing with a lot of complex economic issues, that unions seem to be one of the directions that people are turning in as a potential solution to some of those issues. The second quick thing I want to just touch on is Georgia, the country, not the state, is attempting to pass what is being euphemistically referred to as a foreign agents bill. And this has resulted in massive street protest by Georgia's citizens. And the reason for this is sort of a long running, at least going back to the 90s with the collapse of the USSR and the the breakup of the Commonwealth of Independent States. And you saw a lot of these former Soviet republics that nominally turned to democracy, but very quickly you saw some autocrats come in and take over. And Georgia has traditionally been pretty close to Russia's orbit, and like several other former Soviet republics, ostensibly they have a democratic system, but in reality the head of the state is more of a strongman that is propped up by Vladimir Putin and Moscow. And this bill is very similar to a similar piece of legislation that Russia passed a few years back, that requires organizations, particularly civil society organizations, so those that are working to provide more open, democratic sort of norms, they have to disclose if they receive overseas funding. They have to, and it's a label that basically is a foreign agent bill, right? And so this can impact the trust that these organizations have. It can impact their fundraising, and it causes this sort of chilling effect where these organizations, and we know this because we've seen this effect in Russia, suffer reduced funding, and members of these organizations are often targeted by the state for harassment and imprisonment. So the citizens of Georgia have been very vocal that they do not want this sort of thing, but the regime has been equally adamant, likely because they need to pass something like this to remain in Moscow's good graces, that they are going to push this forward. So far, the protests have been not particularly contentious or violent, but we'll see what happens as this moves forward, because there's always the potential for these to become more violent, either through radical flank action, which we'll discuss here in a little bit, or through the state deciding that it's had enough and enough is enough, and just cracking down and repressing the street protests. Before we jump into the various movements that are related to the Israel-Palestine conflict, I wanted to talk a little bit about a trend that is affecting probably everyone who is listening and watching this podcast and video, but you may not know it, which is the sale of user data to generative AI companies like OpenAI or ChatGPT for the purposes of training their generative AI. And there was a little bit of a headline earlier last week about Stack Overflow, which is a website where software programmers can sort of communicate and share tips and help each other with code and programming. Stack Overflow announced that they had made a deal to share the posts, user-generated content with OpenAI to help OpenAI train their artificial intelligence products. And over the weekend, we saw another deal with OpenAI striking a deal with Reddit to take Reddit posts, user-generated content there, and use those posts as a way of training their artificial intelligence. And the reason I say that this has been ongoing for a while and you may not have noticed is for most of the big players in artificial intelligence, They don't need particularly to go out and buy additional platforms for content, although they certainly are looking for these platforms that have content. But if we look at something like Google or Apple or Meta or Microsoft, these are all companies that already have established pipelines of user data that they can take and train their artificial intelligence agents on. Um, and this gets to sort of an interesting burgeoning protest movement. In the instance of Stack Overflow, you saw engineers going in and changing their information and the answers they had provided to incorrect answers in the hopes of poisoning the artificial intelligence by giving it bad data, making it unreliable. Something we had seen previously with programs like Nightshade, which were meant to poison visual art. And this is sort of an interesting pivot for the artificial intelligence community because they really got in a lot of hot water and pushback initially when people started digging into, well, how did you train these generative artificial intelligence bots? And the answer was sort of a sheepish, well, we plagiarized. So the awareness that that was not going to fly is now informing these efforts to go out and find established data. Now, the problem comes to where you have users that are likely unaware that for almost all of these platforms, as part of the terms of service that they agreed to turn over the data of not just back-end sort of metrics, but also content that they created. So the posts you put on Facebook, the photos, the memes, all of these things, the chats you have over Microsoft Messenger, the emails you send through Gmail, are all sources potentially for these companies to train their artificial intelligence, where they own that data because of the terms of service that you agreed to when you agreed to use these products. And this gets sticky because a lot of people probably have some reservations about this. And again, you're starting to see some pushback. And then there's the idea of, who's doing the work here, right? You have platforms that have provided a service as a platform, but are now shifting to a business model where their product is not the platform for a consumer, but rather the consumer is the raw material and the product is the productions by those users. And this mirrors similar debates that have been had in the European Union and gave rise to things like the GDPR, which strengthened user rights to data. But we have lagged behind that here in the United States, and as a result, I think you're really going to see an increase in platforms seeking to lure users in to generate content for them that they can then sell to these companies that have a overwhelming and never-ending need to train their artificial intelligence. All right. And this is likely something that we will come back to and talk about again and again. So I want to talk just briefly about the Eurovision protests that occurred this year. So Eurovision happened a couple of weeks ago. Congratulations to Switzerland and Nemo for winning. And this was completely overshadowed by the protests and near protests that occurred alongside Eurovision by people outside the venue who were protesting Israel's inclusion, as well as a number of artists who were warned and in some cases sanctioned for attempting to show signs of solidarity for Palestine. And these included performers such as Ireland's Bambi Thug, who had, I believe, a final rehearsal scratched because they were showing solidarity using an ancient Celtic writing. And Sweden's Eric Saad, who is of Palestinian descent and had tied a keffiyeh around his wrist, which was deemed to be an unacceptable political signifier. And this gets interesting because you got a lot of people that were very upset, and were calling on the European Broadcasting Union, which runs the show, to either allow performers to make these statements or to exclude Israeli participation. And the EBU, for its part, reiterated repeatedly that it was non-political, but it is fair to argue that claiming neutrality, claiming non-politicality, is tantamount to siding with the oppressor in these instances. If you see a bully beating somebody up in the schoolyard, and you say, "I'm neutral," you're benefiting the aggressor in these instances. And so this was largely seen as the EBU tacitly siding with Israel and excluding sort of the Palestinian viewpoint. And I would just say that from a movement perspective, this is unsurprising, right? The EBU is not a political organization in the sense that it gets involved in these things, and for the EBU, their motivation is money. And Israel, like other broadcasters, contributes a fair amount of money, so they are not going to miss out on that. Whereas I'm sure if you were to ask them, showing support for Palestine is likely a fiscal risk for them. So, when we talk about sort of asking corporate actors to engage in social responsibility or social protest or these sorts of things, one of the barriers is often that they are only going to do so when it is fiscally advisable, right? This is why you see large corporations that tend to, when they do philanthropic giving, when they do social responsibility, it tends to be very anodyne, very safe sorts of things, the kind of things that no one's going to get upset at, right? We're going to give a lot of money to puppies, right? There's not a huge anti-puppy lobby out there that's going to rake them over the coals for that. So when we look at the Eurovision and EBU, this is a highly charged issue, right? The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is probably one of the hottest stoves out there right now in terms of political danger for staking to one side or another for a large business entity like the EBU. So when you look at their response, it is disappointing from a moral and ethical standpoint, but it is unsurprising from a pragmatic and business standpoint that they would not want to rock the boat, not want to cause upset. So domestically here in the U.S., related to the Israel-Palestinian conflict, we have seen a resurgence in campus protests, including my alma mater, the University of California, Irvine, which really just had an absolute bonkers meltdown over their emergency text notification system last week, over a couple hundred students setting up outside of a lecture hall. And I believe they ended up calling in something like 7 or 8 different police departments from across Orange County who arrived in full-on riot gear to really drag off these peaceful protesters. And this is something we've obviously seen elsewhere, most notably Columbia, but you've seen a lot of different universities have to reckon with what level of student protest is acceptable, what level of student protest is allowable, and how do you respond to pressure by students who have sort of demands, right? And what's been interesting to look at is the larger universities have almost universally responded with repression and force. They have called in, if they do not have a police department themselves, they've called in local police. Often, you know, allowing these police to be fairly brutal in the suppression of the protests. And this has sort of pulled the blankets back on, particularly again for these larger research-oriented universities, where really they're less in the business now of educating students. That's not to say that tuition isn't important, but their real money makers are sort of the private relationships that they have with donors and alumni, and that sort of changes the calculus, where they're not necessarily as beholden to students. They're more interested in moneyed interests and keeping those happy. So again, similar to the EBU and Eurovision, you have very risk-averse university administrators and very trigger-happy police being brought into a situation where you have 18, 19, 20-year-olds who are exploring sort of their political awakening, as well as older activists that may be joining them to help with some of these movements. But you're seeing colleges crack down in a way that has not been seen in a very long time. Now, this is not necessarily been the case universally. There have been some smaller and mid-sized universities that are much more student-driven, that have been willing to meet with students, and a handful have sort of, I don't want to say completely acceded to demands, because that, as far as I'm aware, has not happened, but they have been willing to negotiate and implement some of the demands, including, in some cases, divestment. Which is one of the big sort of demands that these student groups have made. So it's been interesting to watch it. One of the comparisons that you see in news, CNN in particular, seems to be liking to run with this, is that it's just like the 60s. I would push back on that characterization a little bit. This is a different sort of movement. You are not seeing the same levels of support. It is a much smaller minority of students, but it is, I would say, an important minority of students. For a lot of these universities, it is a lot of students who are first generation, who come from, who are students of color, and part of this reason is because for them they see the Israel-Palestine conflict as a colonialist struggle in addition to a incipient genocide, and so they see this as a continuation of the work that has been ongoing through the latter half of the 20th century to dismantle these colonialist structures, and that Israel's relationship to the Palestinians is that of a colonial power to its subject population. And so there is a framing here that is different, but that resonates with people who often come from backgrounds where they have that colonialism in their family history, and so they tend to see this differently than, I would say, many of the university administrators, who see this as, oh look, students getting upset again. All right, there's a fundamental disconnect in the understanding of the hows and the whys of this protest. So the other thing I want to use this as a springboard into is looking at this concept of what is called the radical flank. So one of the claims by these universities is that the reason they are cracking down on these protests and the reason they cannot allow them to continue is that it's not the students that are the problem. It is outside agitators who are coming in and upping the ante and really are the ones who are becoming violent and disruptive and need to be cleared out. There is, let's say, dubious evidence of this, but it is descriptive of a dynamic really first formulated in the 80s by Herbert Haines when he was examining the U.S. civil rights movement from the 1950s and 1960s. And simply put, the radical flank is the idea that a given protest movement gathered around a grievance, right, the thing that you are upset about, draws a diversity of support, and some of that support is going to be more extreme, right? There are extremists that are often part of any political movement. It is not, right, it's not a condemnation of the movement itself. Haines, for his part, was talking primarily about Martin Luther King, who was the establishment civil rights leader, as opposed to Malcolm X, who was seen as the radical firebrand. And Haines said that this radical flank exists sort of to the edge of the mainstream movement, but can push and pull it. In the same way that you can, if you have a heavy weight, it's going to pull you to one side, right? And the less successful the movement is in the immediate term, the more empowered radical flank movements often become. But the more centrist mainstream elements of a protest movement can use the radical flank as leverage when dealing with institutional elites, politicians, the state, or whoever it is they're negotiating with that has the potential to make the social change. So again, if we go back to civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s, you had incidences where the mainstream civil rights movement, again, sort of represented by Martin Luther King and the coalition of organizations that he was the face of, were able to successfully leverage the threat of more extreme elements of the civil rights movement, like Malcolm X, like the Black Panther Party, to bring white elites and white politicians to the negotiating table under the understanding of, you can negotiate with us, that is the sort of the mainstream Martin Luther King-led civil rights movement, or you can negotiate with these guys who are calling for armed revolution, who are calling for shooting police in the streets, right? And you need to choose, because if you completely delegitimate your mainstream, quote unquote mainstream political actors like your Martin Luther Kings, then that pushes people towards those extremist groups. Now, what does this have to do with Israel and Palestine? Well, the long history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has seen repeatedly the Israeli political establishment opting to not negotiate with the more centrist elements of the Palestinian people, like the PLO, which was Yasser Arafat's organization, or some of the more centrist-leaning organizations now. And as a result, these organizations have lost legitimacy. You'll hear people talk about, well, the Palestinians voted for Hamas. Well, they voted for Hamas, but only after all of the centrists they had voted for had failed, had been pushed out, had been ignored by Israel. And what you're really seeing then is a desperation attempt on the part of the Palestinian people for someone and anyone to come in and help out, right? They tried the more centrist approach. And when that failed, you saw a move towards the radical flank. And people may say, well, then, that's just counterproductive. Au contraire. Movement scholars will tell you about this concept called the success of the unruly. And this comes out of a work by Bill Gamson, who's a political scientist and sociologist, who looked at movements throughout the 20th century and found that those that were more disruptive, those that not necessarily violent, but in some cases were violent, but those that were more willing to push the limits and really take a more disruptive stance, we're more successful. So, and he called this the success of the unruly. And where this gets into radical flank is if you were part of the establishment, in this case with Israel and Palestine, if you're the Israeli government, you have an option to deal with the moderates, or you have an option to ignore them and enhance the flank. And I think the problem with that is it has emboldened and strengthened Hamas, which, let me be clear, is a really terrible terrorist organization that has very little concern for human life or decency, but is also really the only viable political option at this point for many Palestinians, because other Palestinian political entities have been delegitimized over the decades, as this conflict has sort of gone on and evolved. So the radical flank also is it's a double-edged sword, right? While contentiousness and extremism can push forward and have some immediate outcomes, there's also a lot of consequences. And I think this is where it becomes important to understand that just because somebody lives in the Palestinian occupied territories, identifies as Palestinian, and lives in an area which is overseen by Hamas, does not mean that they support Hamas. One of the things that moving towards a more radical and extremist stance does is that it undermines your public support. People don't like being with the violent psycho, right? It also ratchets up legal consequences, or international sanction consequences. So part of the difficulty that the Palestinian people have had is that by aligning with their radical flank, by aligning to some extent with Hamas, it has undermined support on the international stage. So you do see sort of people trying to thread that needle of saying, yes, I live in this place where we do have Hamas, but I don't necessarily support them. But they also have to be careful not to condemn them too much, because there are supporters who may, take it out on them as well. The other thing that happens is it impacts your coalition alliances. Hamas does not enjoy a large degree of popular support amongst many of the other Palestinian organizations. They primarily draw their support from Iran, which sees them as sort of useful idiots for pushing a wider agenda that Iran has in the area. And then the final thing that occurs here is you often lose legitimacy. It is hard to shake the reputation for violence and intimidation that extremist groups may acquire as part of the radical flank, and move into a more conciliatory or it's difficult to be included in any resolution at the end. We have very few real-world examples of sort of radical flank extremist groups that were able to move back into a more routine way of legalized political participation, and leave the violence behind. The two that occur to me off the top of my head are Sinn Féin, which was the political wing of the Irish Republican Army in Northern Ireland, who were able to set aside, after the Good Friday Accords, the sort of intimidation and violence that had marked the Irish Republican Army's interactions with Protestant paramilitaries and British police and soldiers, and become part of the government. The other example would possibly be the African National Congress in South Africa, the organization that Nelson Mandela was part of, which certainly had a violent past, including bombings of trains, but was able to turn that around and become much more of a mainstream sort of legitimate political movement. As time went on to move away from that. But it's very difficult by and large. And maybe another day I'll break down sort of the allure and the danger of radical extremism for activist groups and how it often becomes self-reinforcing. So that's sort of the activist side of the radical flank. Now, the other thing that happens is if you are the establishment, if you are the state and the elites, in this case, if you are Israel, um, radical flank movements often allow and drive public support for more repressive capacity. That is, you can crack down on these groups harder and in more extreme way than you would against peaceful protesters, right? And there has been some discussion that Bibi Netanyahu, who's the current prime minister of Israel, has specifically embraced this sort of approach where he realized that he could deal with the moderates or he could delegitimize them and pump up the radical flank, because if he's dealing with the radical flank, he has more leeway for violent repression, right? And you do see this in the discussions where it's not, everything in the West Bank is a Hamas target, it seems like. And that's because Hamas is an extremist organization. It is not, a legitimate actor in the eyes of many a people. And so saying that you're going after a terrorist organization, even if you and this certainly happens, are willing to describe anybody who is a male above the age of 13 as a terrorist, that allows you for greater repression and more brutal repression. So you have this state and institutional response where government, media, and other institutions don't want to provide sort of right. It gets into this tendency we have both in politics and in news media to see things in the simplest possible terms, as either good or evil, black or white. And in that perspective, then we don't have time for the nuance of why people may be driven to the radical flank. We just have the radical flank is evil, the state is good, ergo, state repression of the radical flank is a classic struggle of good versus evil. You certainly see this in more right-wing coverage of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You see this in the way that if you decide to go online, I don't recommend it, and argue with people, they will often throw the Palestinian equals Hamas equals terrorist. Right? It's an oversimplification of what is an extremely complex situation that is rooted in a deep and antagonistic history in the region. But it is simple, and it's one that has plenty of support due to the fact that it is beneficial to one of the sides, right? And I would say that if we're looking at impact in Western media, Israel has far more of a standing and a mouthpiece to put their messages out than Hamas does. You're not seeing CNN cover press conferences by Hamas in the way you see them cover press conferences by the Israeli government. So again, this radical flank allows the state to do this sort of increased crackdown, this delegitimizing of the other side, and it allows them to frame the entire movement as violent and illegal. And drawing this back to the U.S. context with the campus protests, you see the same sort of, even though I would say there's not necessarily good evidence of a radical flank, at least a coherent one in the U.S. campus protests, you have people who have learned these lessons and are willing to apply it here and say, well, it's only a matter of time, or some of them are extremist, and therefore that allows us to do all the repression we want because these are ultimately bad people. You get this a lot from the man on the street interviews that reporters will do, and they'll ask them, well, what do you think about these protests in Colombia or elsewhere? And somebody will say, well, I don't know why these students are supporting Hamas. Which, look, maybe there have been incidences of people supporting Hamas at these things, but I would venture to say that that has not been the representative. I have talked to several of the protesters that have been involved in a couple of these protests across the country, and support for Hamas is not part of it, right? It's support for the Palestinian people. But again, if you have a radical flank situation coming out of the occupied territories where the Palestinians are conflated with Hamas and that all Palestinians are part of Hamas, you have an easier way of transporting that to here, to the media sphere in the United States and in Western Europe, and making that argument again because it's already been established and it's effective, right? If you're a college administrator, it is far easier to say that you're cracking down on these kids because they're supporting a terrorist organization than you're cracking down on these kids because it doesn't look good for your donors, and you need an excuse to clear them out. So you have this usage of the radical flank in a way that is changing and evolving, and it if you were to ask me what the take-home lesson is here, it would be that it is better to negotiate with the more pragmatic and reasonable protesters rather than to repress them, which in and of itself is one of the things that drives people into these more extremist and radical stances on an issue. So I hope you feel like you've learned something. Right, there we go. We can see it here today in Israel-Palestine and student protests. And one thing to say about Israel has its own radical flank that it is extremely savvy about using. In this case, extremist settlers who provide sort of a deniable asset for ratcheting up tension and violence when they come across Palestinians. So you have Israel, I'd say, is an interesting example because they are at the same time encouraging their opponent to become more radical while sort of backdoor feeding their own radical elements in a way that has the potential to really backfire. All right, so here's the credits. I just want to say this is it for this time. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you're watching this on YouTube, or if you are listening to this on your platform of choice. Please subscribe. If you have any questions, corrections, feedback, or suggestions, feel free to let me know in the comments, or you can email me at brcross, CROSS, at silvertreeconsultancy.net. That's consultancy with a Y at the end, and .net because .com costed too much. Until next time, here's to understanding why the world is on fire.